The tank commander never heard the shot that killed him. Eastern Front, 1943, a German soldier stands 6 feet from a Soviet T-34, raises what looks like an oversized pistol, pulls the trigger, and the 30-ton war machine erupts in flames without a single sound betraying the attack. This is the story of a weapon so secret, so devastatingly effective, and so controversial that the Nazi regime ordered every trace of it destroyed before Allied forces could discover its existence. A weapon that violated every convention of warfare, that challenged everything military strategists thought they knew about anti-tank combat, and that represented one of the most audacious engineering achievements of the entire war. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. This weapon wasn't a rocket launcher, it wasn't a magnetic mine, and it wasn't even particularly complicated. It was a pistol, barely 6 inches long, that could penetrate armor thick enough to stop artillery shells. And the question that haunted Allied intelligence for decades after the war was simple. How did it work? And why did the Germans go to such extreme lengths to erase all evidence that it ever existed? The weapon had no official designation in German records, or rather, any records that mentioned it were systematically destroyed in the final days of the war. Survivors who encountered it knew it only by the name whispered among German assault engineers, the Panzertoter, the tank killer. And the few Soviet tankers who survived encounters with it described something that seemed impossible. A German soldier approaching on foot, carrying what appeared to be a handheld weapon no larger than a flare gun, getting close enough to touch the tank, and then the world exploding into fire and concussive force that tore through armor plate like it was paper. But Soviet intelligence officers who investigated these reports initially dismissed them as combat stress or exaggeration because the physics simply didn't make sense. A handheld weapon that could defeat tank armor required either enormous kinetic energy, like an anti-tank rifle, or a massive explosive charge, like a satchel charge or magnetic mine. And neither of those could be delivered from a 6-inch pistol. Yet the reports kept coming, from different sectors of the front, from different tank crews, always describing the same thing: a silent weapon that destroyed tanks at point-blank range, and the terrifying effectiveness with which German assault troops wielded it in the desperate defensive battles of 1943 and 1944. To understand how this weapon came to exist, we need to go back to 1942, when the German army was facing a crisis that threatened to unravel their entire Eastern Front strategy, because Soviet tank production had reached levels that German intelligence had believed impossible. The T-34 medium tank, with its sloped armor and powerful 76mm gun, was being produced at rates exceeding 1,000 units per month. German panzer divisions were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Their own tank production couldn't keep pace, and infantry units found themselves increasingly helpless against Soviet armor attacks. Traditional anti-tank weapons, like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, were effective but had serious limitations. They produced massive backblast that revealed the shooter's position, they were bulky and difficult to carry in quantity, and they required clear lines of sight over significant distances to be effective. In urban combat, in forests, in the close terrain of the Eastern Front, where visibility might be measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, these weapons were often useless. German assault engineers needed something different, something that could be used at point-blank range, something that was silent and didn't betray the shooter's position, something small enough that a single soldier could carry multiple rounds, and something devastatingly effective against the heaviest Soviet armor. And this is where the story gets murky, where official records end and speculation begins. Because what happened next was a weapons development program so classified that even today, 80 years later, we have only fragments of the truth. Somewhere in the labyrinth of German weapons research establishments, possibly at Kummersdorf, possibly at one of the secret facilities scattered across occupied Europe, a team of engineers began working on a radical concept that would eventually become the Panzertoter. And the core idea was both brilliant and insane. What if you could deliver a shaped charge explosive directly against tank armor using a weapon small enough to fit in your hand? Shaped charges were not new technology. The British had pioneered them in the 1930s, and by 1942, both sides were using them in various anti-tank weapons. The principle was elegant: arrange explosive in a cone shape with a metal liner, detonated from the back, and the explosion collapses the liner into a jet of superplastic metal traveling at speeds exceeding 25,000 feet per second. This jet could penetrate armor not through kinetic impact, but through a combination of extreme heat and pressure that essentially melted and pushed aside the metal, creating a hole through which the remaining explosive force and metal fragments would penetrate into the tank's interior, killing the crew and detonating ammunition. But shaped charges had always been large, mounted on rockets or projectiles or mines, because conventional wisdom said you needed a large charge to achieve meaningful penetration. The German engineers working on the Panzer-Toter program asked a different question. What if you could miniaturize the shaped charge to an extreme degree, but compensate for the reduced penetration by placing it directly against target armor with no standoff distance? This was the key insight that made the Panzer-Toter possible, and it required solving a series of engineering problems that seemed almost insurmountable, because a shaped charge needs a specific standoff distance from the target to form its penetrating jet properly. Too close, and the jet doesn't fully form; too far, and it disperses before impact. The optimal standoff is typically several times the diameter of the charge, but if you're holding a pistol-sized weapon against tank armor, you have zero standoff. So the German engineers designed a projectile that created its own standoff. A small rocket-assisted projectile that would be fired from the pistol, travel forward several inches to achieve optimal standoff distance, and then detonate its shaped charge warhead against the armor. The entire flight time from firing to detonation was measured in milliseconds, so fast that to any observer it appeared instantaneous. And here's where the silent aspect comes in. The weapon used a unique propulsion system that generated minimal noise and almost no visible signature. Instead of conventional gunpowder, which produces a loud report and a bright muzzle flash, the Panzer-Toter used a cold gas propulsion system. Compressed nitrogen or possibly carbon dioxide stored in a small cylinder at the base of the pistol. When you pulled the trigger, a valve opened, releasing a burst of high-pressure gas that launched the projectile down a smooth-bore barrel at relatively low velocity, perhaps 200 feet per second, which is subsonic and therefore produces no sonic boom. The gas release itself made a soft hissing sound, easily masked by the ambient noise of combat. And there was no muzzle flash to reveal the shooter's position at night. The projectile itself was a masterpiece of miniaturization, approximately 20 millimeters in diameter and perhaps 60 millimeters long. It consisted of a small solid-fuel rocket motor that ignited immediately upon leaving the barrel, accelerating the projectile and providing the brief powered flight needed to reach optimal standoff distance. A shaped charge warhead with a copper liner designed to penetrate approximately 80 to 100 millimeters of armor plate, which was sufficient to defeat the side and rear armor of most Soviet tanks, and a piezoelectric impact fuse that detonated the warhead on contact with the target. The entire projectile weighed perhaps 100 grams, light enough that a soldier could carry 20 or 30 rounds in pouches and pockets, and the pistol itself was equally compact. Estimates suggest it was approximately 150 millimeters long, roughly 6 inches, with a bore diameter of about 20 millimeters. The frame was constructed from stamped steel and aluminum alloys to minimize weight, and the entire weapon probably weighed less than a kilogram when loaded. By comparison, a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon weighed over 5 kilograms and could only be used once. The Panzer-Toter was reloadable, with each compressed gas cylinder providing perhaps 10 shots before requiring replacement. But the truly revolutionary aspect of the weapon was its tactical employment, and this is where the Panzertoter transformed anti-tank combat from a long-range duel into something far more intimate and terrifying. Because the effective range of the weapon was measured in meters, probably no more than 5 to 10 meters maximum, which meant that to use it, a soldier had to get almost close enough to touch the enemy tank. This sounds suicidal, and in many ways it was, but German assault engineers developed tactics that made it terrifyingly effective. They worked in two-man teams, one soldier carrying the Panzertoter and ammunition, the other providing security and covering fire. They moved using urban terrain, rubble, destroyed vehicles, and any available cover to approach Soviet tanks from the side or rear where armor was thinnest. They struck at dawn or dusk when visibility was poor, and the chaos of combat provided opportunities for close approach. And most critically, they exploited the tank's greatest vulnerability, its limited vision. Because a tank crew inside a buttoned-up vehicle has extremely restricted visibility. Small vision ports and periscopes provide only narrow fields of view. There are massive blind spots all around the vehicle, particularly at the sides and rear. And in combat, when hatches are closed and the crew is focused on threats to their front, a soldier moving carefully could sometimes approach to within touching distance without being detected. The attack sequence was brutally simple. Approach to within 5 meters of the target tank, preferably from the side or rear. Aim the Panzertoter at a point on the hull or turret where armor was thinnest and where penetration would reach the crew compartment or ammunition storage, pull the trigger, the weapon hisses softly as the projectile launches, travels forward for perhaps 20 milliseconds, and then detonates its shaped charge against the armor. The penetrating jet burns through the steel plate in microseconds, and the follow-through blast and fragments kill the crew or detonate ammunition. The entire attack from trigger pull to tank destruction takes less than half a second, and because the weapon is nearly silent and produces no visible signature, other Soviet tanks in the area often don't realize an attack has occurred until their companion vehicle is already burning. This created a psychological terror effect that was almost as important as the physical damage. Because Soviet tank crews operating in urban terrain or forests began to fear that any moment an invisible German soldier might be crouching next to their tank with a Panzertoter aimed at their hull. This fear degraded combat effectiveness, made crews reluctant to operate in close terrain, and sometimes caused them to abandon perfectly functional tanks rather than risk close encounters with German assault engineers. And if you're fascinated by hidden WW2 secrets and weapons that completely change the nature of armored warfare like this, make sure to like this video. Because what made the Panzertoter truly revolutionary wasn't just its technical characteristics, but the way it inverted the traditional dynamics of anti-tank combat. For the entire history of armored warfare up to that point, the advantage had belonged to the vehicle. Tanks were powerful, mobile, heavily armored, and armed with weapons that could kill infantry at ranges where infantry couldn't effectively fight back. Anti-tank weapons were responses to this imbalance, attempts to give infantry a fighting chance, but they were always reactive, always trying to catch up to improvements in tank armor and design. The Panzertoter changed this dynamic fundamentally because it gave a single infantryman the ability to destroy a tank not by engaging it at range, but by getting close, by turning the tank's own mass and armor into a liability rather than an asset. Because in close terrain, a 30-ton tank is actually at a disadvantage against a single determined soldier who can move silently, hide in spaces too small for the vehicle, and strike from blind spots the crew can't cover. This was a revolutionary tactical concept, and the fact that the Germans developed a weapon specifically optimized for this kind of combat showed sophisticated understanding of how armored warfare was evolving in the brutal close-quarters environment of the Eastern Front. But here's what makes the Panzertoter story even more fascinating and frustrating. We have almost no photographic evidence that it existed. No surviving examples of the weapon have ever been found, and German documentation is suspiciously absent. This is not an accident. because in the final weeks of the war, as German forces retreated and Allied armies closed in from all directions, orders went out from German high command to destroy all evidence of certain classified weapons programs. The Panzertoter was apparently on that list. Facilities where it had been manufactured were systematically demolished, documents were burned, prototypes and production models were destroyed, and the engineers and soldiers who had worked on the program were scattered or killed in the final battles. The question is, why? What made this particular weapon so sensitive that the Germans went to extraordinary lengths to prevent it from falling into Allied hands? Several theories have been proposed by military historians and weapons researchers, and the truth probably involves elements of all of them. First, the technology itself was considered extremely valuable, and the Germans didn't want the Soviets or Western allies to reverse engineer it and potentially use it against remaining German forces or in future conflicts. The shaped charge principles were known, but the miniaturization and the cold gas propulsion system represented significant innovations that could have applications beyond just anti-tank weapons. Second, and more darkly, there's evidence that the Panzertoter may have been used in operations that violated the laws of war, specifically in partisan suppression operations and in the execution of prisoners. Because a silent weapon that could kill at close range and produce catastrophic wounds had obvious applications beyond destroying tanks. And if German forces had used Panzertoters in war crimes, the leadership would have strong incentive to destroy all evidence before war crimes tribunals began their work. Third, the weapon may have incorporated technology or design elements that were considered so advanced that they represented a significant intelligence coup if they fell into Allied hands. Remember that in 1945, both the United States and Soviet Union were engaged in a frantic race to capture German scientists, facilities, and weapons technology. The Panzertoter might have represented a capability that German leadership wanted to keep from both sides, hoping to use it as a bargaining chip or to preserve it for some imagined future resurrection of German military power. But whatever the reason, the destruction was thorough, and for decades after the war, the Panzertoter remained a ghost. Mentioned in scattered Soviet after-action reports, referenced obliquely in a few German veteran memoirs, but with no physical evidence to prove it had ever existed. Western intelligence agencies investigated. They interrogated captured German weapons designers, they pored over recovered documents, and they interviewed Soviet veterans who claimed to have encountered the weapon. What they pieced together was fragmentary but compelling. Combat reports from 1943 and 1944 described German assault engineer units, specifically Stoßtrupp formations, trained in close-quarters combat, achieving improbable success rates against Soviet armor in urban terrain, particularly in the battles for cities like Kharkov, Zhytomyr, and later in the defense of Budapest and Berlin. Casualty reports showed Soviet tank losses that couldn't be explained by conventional anti-tank weapons. Specifically, tanks destroyed at close range with penetrating hits to side and rear armor, but with no evidence of Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck backblast damage to surrounding structures. German soldiers captured in 1944 and 1945 occasionally mentioned a special anti-tank weapon issued to assault engineers, though they were often vague about details, possibly because they had been ordered not to discuss it, or possibly because the weapon was distributed in such limited quantities that most soldiers never saw it. Material science analysis of some damaged Soviet tanks recovered from Eastern Front battlefields showed penetration characteristics consistent with shaped charge warheads, but with unusual features that didn't match known German anti-tank weapons. Specifically, the penetration channels were smaller diameter than those produced by Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck, suggesting a smaller but more focused shaped charge. And metallurgical analysis of the penetration edges showed temperature and pressure characteristics indicating a very efficient shaped charge design with minimal wasted energy. All of this was circumstantial, intriguing but not conclusive, and the Panzertoter might have remained a historical footnote, a probable but unproven weapon, except for a discovery made in 1947 in the ruins of a German research facility near Kummersdorf. Soviet occupation forces, still searching German sites for useful technology, found a concealed underground chamber that had apparently escaped the systematic destruction orders. Inside were fragments of technical drawings, partial specifications for what appeared to be a compact anti-tank weapon system, and most significantly, a damaged prototype of what could only be the Panzertoter. The prototype was incomplete, badly damaged, possibly deliberately sabotaged before the facility was abandoned. But it was enough to confirm that the weapon had indeed existed. Soviet engineers examined the prototype carefully, photographed and documented it, and then classified everything under the highest security restrictions, because they realized that the Germans had developed a weapon system that posed a serious threat to Soviet armor doctrine, which relied heavily on mass tank formations. If this technology became widespread, if other nations developed their own versions, the Soviet advantage in armored warfare could be significantly degraded. So the information was locked away, shared only with a small number of Soviet weapons designers who were tasked with developing countermeasures and possibly creating their own version of the technology. Western intelligence didn't learn about the Soviet discovery until years later, and even then only in fragmentary form through defector reports and signals intelligence. The Cold War secrecy that surrounded anything related to anti-tank weapons meant that information about the Panzertoter remained classified and compartmented. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that researchers finally got access to Soviet archives and could begin piecing together the full story. And what they found was both fascinating and disturbing, because the Panzertoter had been even more effective than the fragmentary wartime reports had suggested. Soviet analysis of their own tank losses in 1943-44 showed that in specific sectors where German assault engineer units were active, tank casualties from unknown causes at close range spiked dramatically. In some cases, entire tank platoons were destroyed in urban combat situations where conventional anti-tank weapons should have been ineffective. German assault engineer units equipped with Panzertoters could apparently infiltrate into urban areas held by Soviet forces, wait in ambush positions, and systematically destroy tanks as they moved through streets and around buildings. The silent nature of the weapon meant that the first indication of attack was often when a tank simply exploded, with no warning shot, no visible attacker, no way to determine where the threat was coming from. This created a tactical situation that Soviet tank commanders found almost impossible to deal with, because the standard response to anti-tank weapons was to identify the firing position and suppress it with overwhelming firepower. But with the Panzertoter, there was no firing position to identify, no muzzle flash, no backblast, no sound signature, just a tank suddenly dying. And by the time surviving crew members could react, the attacker had often already disappeared into rubble or buildings. Soviet countermeasures eventually included never operating tanks individually in urban terrain, always moving in groups with infantry support, using infantry scouts to clear buildings and potential ambush positions before tanks advanced, mounting additional armor plates on the sides and rear of tanks to increase protection, and most drastically, in some cases, avoiding urban terrain entirely and accepting the operational limitations that imposed. But even these measures had limited effectiveness, because the fundamental problem remained. A determined soldier with a Panzertoter could kill a tank if he could get close enough. And in the chaos of combat, especially in cities and forests, preventing close approaches was nearly impossible. And if you want to discover more untold WW2 stories and deadly hidden technologies that changed how wars were fought, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear next will blow your mind as we explore the specific battles where the Panzertoter changed the course of combat, and why this weapon remained classified for decades after the war ended. One of the most significant deployments of the Panzertoter was during the Third Battle of Kharkov in February-March 1943, where SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser conducted a counteroffensive that recaptured the city from Soviet forces. German assault engineers, possibly equipped with early production Panzertoters, played a crucial role in urban combat operations. Soviet tank units that had pushed into the city found themselves under attack from all directions, losing vehicles to what commanders described as silent attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Soviet after-action reports from Kharkov note unusually high tank losses in urban terrain despite the fact that German anti-tank gun positions had been largely overrun. One report specifically mentions T-34 tanks being destroyed by unknown means at close range, with penetrations to side armor that didn't match any known German weapon. At the time, Soviet intelligence couldn't explain these losses. They speculated about new magnetic mines or perhaps infiltration teams with satchel charges. But the pattern didn't quite fit those explanations either. Because magnetic mines required time to place and arm, and satchel charges were bulky and difficult to employ against moving or alert targets. The Panzertoter, with its ability to be employed quickly from a few meters distance, fit the evidence far better. But Soviet intelligence in 1943 didn't know the weapon existed, so they couldn't identify it as the cause. Another significant engagement occurred during the Battle of Budapest from December 1944 to February 1945, where German and Hungarian forces defended the city against a Soviet siege. The urban terrain of Budapest was ideal for Panzertoter employment. Narrow streets, countless buildings providing cover and concealment, and Soviet tank units forced to operate in constrained spaces where their mobility and standoff advantages were negated. German assault engineer units reportedly inflicted disproportionate casualties on Soviet armor during the siege, and Soviet commanders became increasingly reluctant to commit tanks into the city center where losses were consistently high. Interestingly, German defensive success in Budapest has often been attributed to effective use of Panzerfaust and anti-tank guns, and certainly those weapons played a role. But the casualty pattern suggests something else was also at work. Specifically, the high number of tanks destroyed at extremely close range, often with minimal damage to surrounding structures that should have shown evidence of Panzerfaust backblast. During the final battle for Berlin in April-May 1945, Panzertoters may have seen their last significant use. German forces defending the city were a chaotic mix of regular army units, SS formations, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth. But among them were veteran assault engineers who carried the Reich's most closely guarded weapons technology into the final apocalyptic battle. Soviet tank units advancing into Berlin suffered significant casualties, far more than they had anticipated given the overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower they possessed. Soviet commanders noted that tank losses in Berlin were disproportionately high compared to infantry casualties, which suggested that German defenders had weapons specifically optimized for anti-tank combat in urban terrain. Marshal Zhukov's operational reports from the Berlin battle mention concerns about new enemy anti-tank weapons and orders for increased tank infantry cooperation to prevent close approaches. By this point in the war, Soviet forces were well aware of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks and had developed tactics to deal with them. But these new weapons that Zhukov's reports mention may have been references to the Panzertoter, employed by desperate defenders who knew the war was lost but fought on anyway. And then, in the final days, as Berlin fell and the Reich collapsed, the Panzertoter disappeared. Destruction orders were executed, facilities were demolished, documents were burned, and the weapon that had killed hundreds, possibly thousands of Soviet tanks simply vanished from history. Or almost vanished, because the scattered evidence remains. The combat reports that don't quite make sense without it, the penetration analysis that suggests a weapon that shouldn't exist, the Soviet prototype found in 1947 and locked away for decades, and the testimony of veterans on both sides who knew something unusual had been used but couldn't or wouldn't provide details. Modern researchers studying the Panzertoter face significant challenges because so much of the evidence is still classified or lost. Russian archives still contain documents related to the 1947 discovery that haven't been fully released. German veterans who might have used the weapon are now deceased, and the physical destruction of the weapon was so thorough that not a single complete example exists in any museum or collection. What we can say with reasonable certainty is that the Germans did develop and deploy a compact, silent anti-tank weapon that used shaped charge technology and cold gas propulsion. It was effective enough to significantly impact Soviet armor operations in specific sectors. And it was considered sensitive enough that extraordinary measures were taken to prevent it from being captured intact. The technical feasibility of such a weapon has been confirmed by modern engineers. The physics of miniaturized shaped charges is well understood today. Cold gas propulsion systems are used in various applications, and the combination of these technologies in a handheld weapon is entirely plausible with 1940s engineering capabilities. What made the Panzertoter remarkable wasn't that it used impossible technology, but that German engineers had the insight to combine existing technologies in a novel way that solved a specific tactical problem. The legacy of the Panzertoter extends far beyond its use in World War II, because the concept it represented, a handheld, silent anti-tank weapon optimized for close-range use, influenced post-war weapons development in ways that are still visible today. Soviet weapons designers, having studied the captured prototype, incorporated some of its concepts into their own anti-tank weapons programs. The RPG-7, developed in the 1960s and still in use today, uses shaped charge technology and can be employed at close range, though it lacks the silent characteristics of the Panzertoter. Western nations, learning about the weapon through intelligence reports, also explored similar concepts. Various experimental weapons programs in the 1950s and 60s investigated compact-shaped charge delivery systems, some using rocket propulsion, others using recoilless rifle principles, and a few experimenting with cold gas or compressed air launch systems. None of these programs produced weapons exactly like the Panzertoter, partly because the tactical situation had changed. The invention of composite armor and reactive armor made simple shaped charges less effective, and the development of guided anti-tank missiles provided a more versatile solution to the problem of killing tanks. But the concept remained influential. Special operations forces, in particular, were interested in silent anti-armor weapons for covert operations, and some of the technology pioneered in the Panzertoter found its way into specialized weapons that remain classified even today. The Panzertoter also influenced tactical thinking about armored warfare and infantry anti-tank operations, because it demonstrated that tanks, despite their armor and firepower, remained vulnerable to determined infantry in close terrain. This lesson shaped post-war military doctrine, leading to increased emphasis on tank-infantry cooperation, development of improved vision systems for armored vehicles, and recognition that urban terrain represents a particularly dangerous environment for armor operations. Modern tank designs incorporate lessons learned from weapons like the Panzertoter, with improved side and rear armor, better situational awareness systems, active protection systems that can intercept incoming projectiles, and doctrine that emphasizes avoiding situations where infantry can approach to close range. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Panzertoter is what it represents about weapons development under extreme pressure. Because the weapon was born from desperation, from the recognition that Germany was losing the armored warfare battle on the Eastern Front and needed radical solutions. German engineers, working with limited resources and under constant time pressure, created a weapon that was innovative, effective, and terrifyingly lethal. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology, and they produced something that caught their enemies by surprise and forced tactical adaptations. This pattern of desperate innovation under pressure is one of the recurring themes of World War II weapons development. We see it in the development of jet aircraft, guided missiles, assault rifles, and numerous other technologies that emerged from the war. The Panzertoter is perhaps less famous than these other innovations, but it's no less significant as an example of human ingenuity applied to the problem of killing more efficiently. And that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of technological progress and the ethics of weapons development. Because the Panzertoter was undoubtedly a remarkable piece of engineering, elegant in its simplicity, effective in its application, and innovative in its approach. But it was also a tool designed for killing, and its effectiveness is measured in destroyed tanks and dead crews, in tactical victories purchased with blood, and in battles prolonged by a weapon that made already brutal combat even more lethal. Should we admire the engineering while condemning the purpose? Can we appreciate the innovation while recognizing the horror of its application? These questions don't have easy answers, and they become even more complex when we consider that the Panzertoter may have been used not just against tanks, but potentially against civilian targets, in war crimes that were then covered up by destroying all evidence of the weapon. We simply don't know the full story, and because the weapon was so thoroughly erased from history, we may never know. What we do know is that the Panzertoter represents a fascinating chapter in the history of military technology, a weapon that was so effective and so secret that it had to be destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. A weapon that changed tactical thinking about anti-tank warfare and influenced weapons development for decades after, and a weapon that, even 80 years later, remains partially shrouded in mystery and speculation. The 6-inch pistol that could destroy tanks without making a sound. The weapon that Nazi Germany tried to erase from history. The Panzertoter stands as a testament to both human ingenuity and human capacity for violence. It reminds us that in warfare, innovation never stops, that desperate circumstances drive radical solutions, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are not the largest or most obvious, but the small, silent ones that strike from the shadows. If you love discovering the deadly secrets of WW2 weapons and the untold stories of military technology that changed the course of history, make sure to subscribe to this channel, because we're continuously uncovering more hidden histories from the war, from secret weapons projects that were buried by time to battlefield innovations that remain classified even today. A new video revealing even more forgotten technologies is coming very soon, and you won't want to miss it. The Panzertoter, the silent tank killer, the weapon they tried to erase, remains one of World War II's most fascinating mysteries. A small, red-hot piece of history that burned bright for a few years and then was deliberately extinguished, leaving behind only shadows and questions. And the knowledge that sometimes the deadliest weapons are the ones nobody talks about.